I'm very pleased to speak on the Financial Management Amendment Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024, which is another demonstration of the Allan Labor government's commitment to gender equality in Victoria, because it will require in law our budget processes and our budget documents to absolutely acknowledge and understand the gendered impacts that the decisions that the government takes through the budget have on Victorian society and particularly on Victorian women. It will ensure that every budget in the future includes a statement about gender equality. It'll amend Victoria's primary financial management legislation, the Financial Management Act of 1994, to ensure that consideration of gender equality remains one of the key principles of sound financial management, because we understand and we know that sound financial management requires that all issues are taken into consideration and the needs of all Victorians are accounted for, particularly for Victorian women. It is just another step, another iteration, another example of the Allan Labor government's commitment to gender equality in this state. The Labor government passed the Gender Equality Act in 2020, which was a landmark piece of gender legislation to break down gender barriers in the workplace. And this new legislation will complement that Gender Equality Act by allowing the Treasurer to request gender impact assessments on various measures to ensure that gender equality is given the priority it deserves in decision making. Both of these pieces of legislation, the Gender Equality Act and the new gender responsive budgeting provisions in the Financial Management Act, will provide a groundbreaking opportunity for the question of gender equality to be at the heart of the policy making of this state and help influence not only public policy but also culture and attitudes, and most importantly achieve better outcomes for Victorian women and girls. Gender responsive budgeting is a tool that has been has been used in other jurisdictions and also in Victoria, I should say, prior to the enactment of this legislation, but this will enshrine that practice in law to ensure that budget-related decisions take account and have an understanding of the gendered impacts that they have when those decisions are made, and also that analysis is then communicated in formal budget documentation as a normal part of the budget process. It will help remove embedded inequalities by considering gender in all funding decisions with a direct impact on Victorians. It will identify how resources can be best allocated to close gender gaps, and will help improve value for money by achieving gender equality goals concurrently with other policy goals. Victoria has been on this journey for some time under this Labor government. In 2021, we were the first state jurisdiction to introduce a form of gender responsive budgeting, and every year as part of the budget process since we commenced that work, we analyse and consider the impacts of our investment decisions on women at every stage of the budget process, and we've kept improving decision-making processes, considering ways in which the decisions that the government is making through the budget process affect people differently, women in particular, and that leads to better decisions. And the movement to promote gender responsive budgeting is grounded in a lot of sophisticated understanding and research about the impact of gender inequalities on our society, not just here in Australia but also internationally. One of the things that the International Monetary Fund has said about the need for gender responsive budgeting to be an important part of fiscal policy is this, and I'll quote, "Fiscal policy design and budget systems can also play a large role in reducing gender inequality. Fiscal authorities can ensure that tax and spending policies and/or public financial management instruments address gender inequality and the advancement of women in areas such as education, health and economic empowerment. This approach is called gender-sensitive or gender-responsive budgeting. If designed well, gender budgeting can improve the efficiency and equity of the overall budget process. Fiscal authorities at any level of government can assess the needs of boys and girls and men and women and identify key outcomes or goals, plan, allocate and distribute public funds and monitor and evaluate achievements. The value of gender-responsive budgeting is that it not only allows us to look at the outcome impacts, the expected outturn impacts of a particular measure on women in particular, through the things like the use of distributional analysis, the understanding of whether a particular course of action, whether a particular policy is going to have a disproportionate impact on women in our community, and allows us to produce those kind of gendered impact assessments that form part of these processes. But it also requires, by its very nature, that those decisions consideration, that analysis gets taken further up the budget planning process, because we know that the process of constructing a budget is one that involves a large number of bodies, a lot of people, a lot of consideration over an extended period of time. And so ensuring, as this legislation will, that all throughout that process, the impact of each of these single decisions that are made, that make up the entirety of the budget process, is thinking about its gendered impact, will in the end and inevitably lead to more consideration of the gendered impacts of particular policy decisions on women, and consider how they might be measured. And I think it's quite clear that, as we have seen both here in this state, but also, as others have mentioned in the context of their contributions, how other jurisdictions, how other levels of government have either taken this task seriously or abjectly failed in it, in considering how these particular, how in particular budget decision making understands and has an economic impact. I think what it does do, and again to just quote from the United Nations, in understanding why this is important, I quote, "Gender-responsive budgeting is not about creating separate budgets for women or solely increasing spending on women's programs. Rather, gender-responsive budgeting seeks to ensure that the collection and allocation of public resources is carried out in ways that are effective and contribute to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. It should be based on in-depth analysis that identifies interventions for implementing policies and laws that advance women's rights. It provides tools to assess the different needs and contributions of men and women and boys and girls within existing revenues, expenditures and allocations, and calls for adjusting budget policies to benefit all groups." End quote. I do want to reflect on how some of that was undertaken, particularly recently or in the last few years, in the context of the government's, the then federal government's response to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw very clearly at the outset of that pandemic the very clear differentiated impacts that were being felt across the workforce, particularly across female-dominated industries. And it was very clear in the early months of that pandemic that women were losing their work, losing their jobs at a much faster rate than men. I had the opportunity at that time to be working in a public policy think tank, and we did some particular work looking at the impacts of the early months of the COVID pandemic on women in work, and found that, for example, there were some months in July 2020 when women in Victoria were losing their jobs at a rate 5 times faster than men. 5 times faster than men. And the number of women unemployed in this state at that time was higher than it had ever been. And what that enabled us to do was to put into the public policy debate a critique of the decisions that were being made by the then Commonwealth government about the design of the programs that they were putting in place to support those who were losing their jobs through the pandemic. And one of the things that they had done in the policy design, particularly in the early months of the policy design, is really failed to account for the gendered impacts of not only the pandemic, but also of the measures that they were putting in place to design policies to support Australians through that absolutely uncertain economic time. And in the early months of the pandemic, the response that was made principally by the provisions of the rules around things like the JobKeeper payment saw them exclude large female-dominated industries, saw them, like early childhood and some of the childcare sectors, saw them exclude on the basis of their their rules about the applicability of that support to things like casualised industries, that because women are more likely to be in insecure work, because women are more likely to be in industries where there are higher rates of casualisation, because women are more likely to be in industries where they hold more than one job, that the design of the supports had was very strongly predicated on outdated notions about single earner households, largely single employer households, largely full-time households, and that historically has been where male-dominated industries have seen. So it was very clear in the early months of that pandemic that the decision-making that was taking place didn't match the reality of what was happening on the ground, and one of the explanations for that was because a gendered lens wasn't being applied to decision-making there. Now, there was a significant critique of the then coalition government's response, and that was really felt in the response to that budget in the federal budget late in 2020. And I think that is an important and illustrative example of where a failure to take account of the gendered impacts, not only of external events on our community, but then also of the government response to those events in our community, can have serious consequences, serious economic consequences, serious consequences for individuals, but also where they are not reflective of community sentiment and not reflective of community attitudes. Because I do think, Acting President, that we have seen and we do see and we are witnessing an acknowledgement across our community that governments being more responsive to gender equality, that governments taking action to demonstrate that they take these issues seriously, is one that is supported obviously by many women in the community, but also by men as well. Because we all understand that our community is made stronger, that our economy is made stronger when the needs of everyone who participate in it are taken into account. When the interests of all are taken into account, everyone benefits. It's not a zero-sum game. And doing things like introducing gender responsive budgeting doesn't mean that someone else is losing out, doesn't mean that someone else is missing out. It means that our decisions are better. And when we make better decisions, when we make decisions that benefit more people in our community, that understand the differences that make up our society, when we make those kind of decisions that are better informed, we all benefit from them. That's why I'm such a strong supporter of move towards gender equality. Because we all benefit from having a more equal society. We all benefit from having mechanisms of our government understanding, acknowledging and responding to the interests, the needs and the challenges that are faced by women and girls in our society. It's not something that only benefits some in our community. Moves like this, the move to equality, benefits all of us. And that's why the Allan Labor government has been such a strong supporter of moves towards gender equality, which is why the documents and the process, the budget process, that help shape what happens in the state of Victoria, making that more gender responsive, making that more gender aware, is going to lead to an improvement in the lives of all Victorians, and that is why I am so strongly supportive of this legislation today.